السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to another episode of the Gems of the Heart, where we try by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to purify our heart, and our hearts to be purified we need knowledge and we need actions. Like everything in the deen of Allah, knowledge is half of the way and the other half is to act according to the proper knowledge. Knowledge is so essential because that's what the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all about. It's about the true knowledge that we need to adopt in our life, to be patient to learn it, and to be patient to apply it in our life. And the purification of the heart is something that throughout generations and generations, throughout the history of mankind, something that human beings have been trying to achieve, at least some of them. And this is something from the revelations from Allah. The purest hearts that ever existed on the face of earth are the hearts of the prophets of Allah. And the best of all of the prophets is Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the purest of all hearts. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us to follow the example of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So the more the Muslim follow the way of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, the more purification of one's heart, his heart would be. And therefore, when we say the sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, it's not just some optional acts of worship as some people think. It's not some outside appearance of actions. It's something that occupies and it's part of the entire entity of the human being. Something for us to follow the Prophet ﷺ in the outside appearance and actions and speech, and more importantly, in our hearts. And the heart has two things in it. It has matters of belief and also actions. Actions done by the heart. So the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the angels, in the last day and so on, has to be pure, has to be upon the truth. And the actions done by the heart has to be according to the way of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Like sincerity, like being patient, like being pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like having certainty, like truthfulness and so on. And if a person, his heart is upon the way of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, imitating the heart of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, definitely that would shows in one's actions and speech. We've been talking about the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as part of the subject of how the aqidah, how matters of belief can purify our hearts. That's the foundation of the religion. And there's nothing more important than matters of belief that would purify the heart of a believer. If a person take all of the means, sometimes people would endure so much suffering in this life, thinking that this is a way for them to purify their hearts by sacrificing so much in this life, by doing patience, by living a life of asceticism, by doing certain things, wearing very rough clothing and the like of this, having a very rough life, thinking that this is the way to purify their souls. But if it's not based on the sound and the proper belief, then all of that is in vain. And they would not increase anything but being away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and polluting their hearts, because it's not according to the way of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So we have the best example, and this best example has been saved for us. So therefore, in any of our affairs, one of which, if a person wants to purify his heart, we should always ask, is this the way of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam or not? So one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, even though some of the people of knowledge, they have differences of opinions about it, but it's definitely an attribute. And the name, there are some differences of opinions about it, and definitely we need to learn about it, and it's a great mean for us to purify our hearts, which is the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, An-Noor, which means the light. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Nuru samawati wal ard. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the light of the heavens and the earth. And this is mentioned, of course, in Surah An-Noor. There's a surah called Surah An-Noor. And even that very important surah, the first verse in it starts with Suratun Anzalnah. It's a surah that we brought down. Even though all of the surahs of the Quran, chapters of the Quran, they were revealed from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So why this specific surah is called Suratun Anzalnaha? This is a surah that we brought down and we made it an obligation and so on and so forth, because of the importance of it. And within the surah, with rulings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, many different rulings, this is basically the light when a person follows the orders of Allah. But let us go back a little bit and think linguistically, from what we understand as human beings. What is the importance of the light in our life? Imagine that there was no light whatsoever. There was no sun, for example. Life would not exist. Light is something that is essential for the people physically. And darkness is always gives the feeling of being lost. No direction whatsoever, no sense of knowing the goals or directions. It gives tightness in one's inside. Person becomes scared, for example. Imagine life is totally dark and nobody's able to see what's in front of them. People won't do anything. Life would not exist without the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is when we talk about the physical light and also the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which everything is by the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The same thing when it comes to the purpose of our life, the guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we'll talk about one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Hadi, the one that guides, and this inshallah ta'ala also something that we talked about it before, which is the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Hadi, something we talked about it before, and it's important for us to link both together. But first, as we said, taking a path that is totally dark, a person would never reach his destination, especially if there are so many different paths and so many different destinations. You want to go to a specific destination, and that's the only way of salvation, and there are endless paths to endless destinations, and you're only ordered to give or to take one path to one destination. This is something that a person would never be able to achieve, especially that the path is full of holes, dangerous things that makes a person slip away to the endless paths. This is exactly how things are to guidance, to reach the pleasure of Allah, to enter the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything is totally dark except one path and one path only, and that is the deen of Islam. The one that is the head of this path, the one that is the head of everybody, is the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. So whoever follow this path, this light, he will be successful. And whoever turns away from it and go to the darknesses, then the end of it is definitely the hellfire. So therefore, it's a very serious matter. And the light is the deen of Islam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the light of the heavens and the earth. And whoever seek light from other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he won't receive anything. And this is the beautiful verse in Surah An-Noor, that the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioned and this attribute is mentioned, which is something very important for us to reflect upon. And how it's in the midst of the surah. This ayah, Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described His light. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the light of the heavens and the earth. مثل نوره كمشكاة فيها مصباح المصباح في زجاجة الزجاجة كأنها كوكب دري يوقد من شجرة مباركة زيتونة لا شرقية ولا غربية, and so on. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the light of the heavens and the earth. The example of His light is like a niche within which is a lamp, and the lamp is within a glass, and the glass as if it were a pearly white star lit from the oil of a blessed olive tree, neither of the east nor of the west, whose oil would almost glow even if untouched by fire. Light upon light, nurun ala nur, light upon light. Allah guides to His light whom He wills, and Allah presents examples for the people, and Allah is knowing of all things. This is an amazing verse that talks about the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as it's mentioned the explanations of it. But in the verse, it says Nurun ala nur. Nurun ala nur, light upon light. Light that can never be comprehended, because nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, يَهْدِ اللَّهُ لِنُورِهِ مَن يَشَاءُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides to His light whoever He wills. So guidance is light. And whoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will, He will guide him to the light of Allah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give examples, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all knower of all things. But then you see immediately right after that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned the houses of Allah. And this is the place where we acquire this light in our life, the light of guidance. في بيوت أذن الله أن ترفع ويذكر فيها اسمه يسبح له فيها بالغدو والأصال. In houses, the masajid, the houses of Allah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the permission for it to be erected and for the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be mentioned. And in it, those who glorify the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the morning and the evening are رِجَالٌ لَا تُلْهِهِمْ تِجَارَةٌ وَلَا بَيْعٌ عَنْ ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ, till the end of the verses that talks about the characteristics of the believers, those who receive the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when they believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He is the light of the heavens and the earth, and they get this light from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from the revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are men that neither tijara, trade, or transactions, buying and selling, would take them away and divert them and make them forgetfulness about the dhikr and the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and establishing the salah and giving the zakah. And they fear a day that the hearts, the eyes will change. This is the day of resurrection. So the point here is, the light is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is the light of the heavens and the earth. And many verses in the Quran, when it talks about the light, it gives two meanings. Whether it's referring to the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or refers to the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give the light. Like as we heard towards the end of this verse, يَهْدِ اللَّهُ لِنُورِهِ مَنْ يَشَاءُ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides to His light. And there is the light that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give to the believers, the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for people to see what is right and what is wrong and so on. When we also think about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the light of the heavens and the earth, and if people disbelieve in Allah and associate partners with Allah, there is no share of them. There's no light for them. Why? Because as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَجْعَلِ اللَّهُ لَهُ نُورًا فَمَا لَهُ مِن نُور. Whoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not make for him light, there's no light for him. This is not, as we see physically in this life, people, they all share the light of the sun. And during the day they're able to walk and they see and so on. But the verses are talking about the light of guidance. For a person to be guided, to be obedient to Allah, to follow the way of the Prophet ﷺ, if people do not seek guidance from Allah, they will stay being astray in darknesses. That's a very delicate understanding, because in all of our affairs, when we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide us, we need to seek guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. People, they have many different ways to seek guidance from, whether it's speeches of individuals, their intellect, their reason, someone would make sense to them, ideas and so on and so forth. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it clear that guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And a person should seek guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, and seek the light only from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. In the Day of Judgment, the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is something that people also would see clearly, and the believers would receive the benefit of it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that in the Quran, وَأَشْرَقَتِ الْأَرْضُ بِنُورِ رَبِّهَا, that the earth will be lit by the light of its Lord, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the book will be established, وَوُضِعَ الْكِتَابُ وَجِيءَ بِالنَّبِيِّينَ وَالشُّهَدَاءِ, and the prophets will be brought, and the martyrs will be brought, and it will be treated and dealt with them with justice. And then the verses goes on at the end of Surah Al-Zumar, where it talks about the day of resurrection. But it mentioned this light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَأَشْرَقَتِ الْأَرْضُ بِنُورِ رَبِّهَا, by the light of its Lord. So the light of its Lord. And the book of deeds will be put, and the prophets and the martyrs will be brought. وَقُضِيَ بَيْنَهُمْ بِالْحَقِّ وَهُمْ لَا يُظْلَمُونَ, and it will be judged among them with the truth, and they would never be treated with injustice. وَوُفِّيَتْ كُلُّ نَفْسٍ مَا عَمِلَتْ وَهُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِمَا يَفْعَلُونَ, and every soul will be given in full what it did and acted upon, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best what everyone did. But then the last two verses, or three verses, talks about the two different groups with regards to the light of the Lord. The disbelievers, those who turned away from the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they were not guided, they were in darknesses. They were in darknesses in this life, even though they physically attained the light of this world, they were able to see and things of that nature, but they were in total darknesses when it comes to guidance. And therefore, this is how we should see things in this life. If a believer believes in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, An-Noor, a believer would seek that light to purify himself and that light is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And a person would see things in the proper way. Disbelievers, disbelief is darkness, is something that we need to stay away from. We don't seek guidance. We don't seek intellect. We don't seek opinions, what is right and what is wrong, and ways of life and so on. We don't seek that from the disbelievers. We seek that from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have in the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam the best example, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to him the perfect revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So this is great benefit when we learn this name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he used to mention the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when he would get up at night to pray the night prayer. We know that the night prayer is a very virtuous act of worship, and it's an optional act of worship, but it's very virtuous. And it's mentioned in the Quran in many verses. And that's something that the Prophet ﷺ would not leave, whether he was traveling or not. He would continue to pray the night prayer. And he would invoke and make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and supplicate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with this name of Allah, with this attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by praising Allah the perfect praise. When he would say alayhi salatu wasalam, Allahumma laka alhamd, anta nuru samawati wal ard. Wa Allah, for you is alhamd, the perfect praise to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You are the light of the heavens and the earth. And so on with the dua. But this is a part of the dua that is important for us to understand, that the Prophet ﷺ would praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with what he knows about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from revelation from Allah. That all of the perfect praises to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because he is the light of the heavens and the earth. And he is the Lord of the heavens and the earth. And he is the one that everything in the heavens and the earth depends and relies on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to even sustain its life. And without the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, life would not even exist. So the Prophet ﷺ would say this in his dua, and he would ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for all of the bounties of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by begging Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with his names and attributes. In the Day of Judgment, and this life versus the Day of Judgment is like one path, which is one path. And what separates us from this hereafter is the moment of death. Something that comes in no time, that takes a person from this life to the first stages of the Day of Judgment and the hereafter. It starts with, after that, the grave and the questioning of the grave and so on. The grave, as the Prophet ﷺ one time he said, إن هذه القبور مليئة ظلمة على أهلها, that these graves is full of darknesses upon its people. It's physically dark. If a person sees the graves how it is, especially when it closes up, it's totally dark. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from the punishment of the grave. And then the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, إِنَّ اللَّهَ مُنَوِّرُهَا بِصَلَاتِي عَلَيْهِمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make it light, will give light to these graves by my prayers and dua for them. So the prayers of the Prophet ﷺ gives light to the darknesses of the graves. And therefore, as the ulama, they say the dua in general. And the good deeds that a person did in this life, this will be the provisions in the hereafter and the light in the hereafter. For a person to receive the light. That light, if people receive it in the hereafter, meaning the believers, they would never want to come back to this world anymore. See, when we think of the hereafter or the grave, we think of the darknesses of the grave and the worms in there, and there's no life, meaning in this world, and a person is deprived from the pleasure of this life, and families and wealth and offsprings and so on. And this is because we're so limited to the materialistic life that we live in. But when the believers, they get to know what is waiting for the believers in the hereafter, in the grave even, in that barzakh, in that transition, even before the day of resurrection. When the angel of death will come and give them the glad tidings and the bishara and the good news from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the believers, they would never want to come back to this world anymore. Never. With all of its delight and happiness and all of these things that people fight over to sustain their life on the face of earth, once the good news comes to them, and this is at the moment of death, the believer would never want to come back to this world anymore. He wants to go forward. Why? Because what's waiting for him is this light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is this goodness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is far beyond one's imagination. The believers, they return to the mercy of Allah. And therefore, it's a very serious, as we said, serious matter to make sure that we live our life as if we are accumulating this light. This accumulation of the light, we are in need of it in our provisions in the hereafter. So this light would benefit the person in his grave, as the Prophet ﷺ said, and in the Day of Judgment, when people will be resurrected. And the stages of the Day of Judgment, one stage after the other, there's a stage which is the most serious of all of them. One of the most serious stages in the Day of Resurrection is when people will cross the Sirat. And the Sirat is a bridge on top of the hellfire. And the other side of the Sirat is Jannah, the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's a space before Jannah, of course. So this is something that the believers will cross. And the only thing that the Prophet of Allah and the Prophets would say at that stage of the Sirat is Allahumma sallim sallim. Oh Allah, sallim, meaning make it safe. Save us, save us. That's it. They don't say anything. They don't intercede for anyone at that stage of the Sirat. And that stage of the Sirat when only the believers will be gathered before the Sirat. And imagine people in that state waiting to cross a bridge that is thinner than a hair and sharper than a sword, and underneath it is the hellfire. And what do we know about the hellfire? Nobody can comprehend the magnitude of the severity of the punishment of the hellfire. So this is underneath it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best how far is the distance. And this is a physical matter that people will see and they have to go through. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran, وَإِن مِّنكُمْ إِلَّا وَارِدُهَا كَانَ عَلَى رَبِّكَ حَتْمًا مَقْضِيًّا, that each and every one of you will get there and they would have to cross the hellfire. But some people, they would fall and some people would cross. And how would people fall and cross and so on is according to the light that they would receive then. And this light that they receive from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He is Noor samawati wal ard, He is the light of the heavens and the earth, is given only to the believers according to how much they accumulated this life in this world. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just and He is the most merciful. So the light will be given according to the actions of the people. And the actions of the people are basically the obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These good deeds that people do in this life are the lights that they would see in the Day of Resurrection. That's why the Prophet ﷺ, he said that the believers are not all in the same level. They won't receive all of them the same light. They would receive the light according to their actions in this world. Some people, their light will be like a mountain, as the Prophet ﷺ said. And the more light is, the faster the person is on top of the Sirat. And the faster the person is, the less that he would get from the fire underneath him. And some people would have the light like a palm tree, and it keeps on decreasing. And some people would have the light like on their toe, on their foot. It goes on and off. And of course, when it's off, a person is about to fall. Then when it's light, he's able to see. And that's an individual thing. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ, he said that some people will cross the Salat like a blink of an eye. And some will cross it like lightning, very fast. They won't feel anything. And they will be on the other side, safe. These are the successful ones. These are the believers that accumulated the light in this life. And those who have less, they would receive some of the pain of the hooks on both sides of the Salat and the hellfire underneath them. And some of them would even fall as a result of not having enough light. So the light that was given in this life is accordingly will be distributed on the Salat, and people will be saved accordingly. But we'll continue with that note, inshallah ta'ala, and more with the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, An-Noor, or the light, after the break. So stay with us, inshallah. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulullah. Welcome back, and with the beautiful name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, An-Noor. And as we said, there are differences of opinions among the ulama whether this is a name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or not. And some said this is not a name of Allah because there's no clear evidence in the Quran or in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ that says that this is the name of Allah or one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but rather an attribute of Allah. And the other opinion, which is opinion also of many, that this is one of the names of Allah, is Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah, he mentioned, and Ibn Khuzaymah and others. So again, but to know the attribute also is something very important. And the reason why I mention these differences of opinions, because as we know that the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we can name ourselves as the slave of, like Abdullah, Abdul Aziz, Abdul Wahab. These are all beautiful names for a person to name his sons and so on. And therefore, to name your son An-Noor is something that a person should stay away from, because of that differences of opinions, and because some said that there's no basis to it, that this is one of the names of Allah. And this is not the way of the Muslims. It's usually for non-Muslims to name this. So this is an important point just to note this. But even when we talk about this is something that is part of what we read in the Quran, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the light of the heavens and the earth. One of the verses, and the word An-Noor is mentioned in many verses in the Quran. But one of the verses that is very, very important for us to also to reflect upon, it gives us the reality of this life. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives an example. And with examples or parables, things becomes very clear. And the clarity of it leaves the person with no choice but to follow the implications of this parable or this example. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَوَمَنْ كَانَ مَيْتًا فَأَحْيَيْنَاهُ وَجَعَلْنَا لَهُ نُورًا يَمْشِي بِهِ فِي النَّاسِ كَمَنْ مَثَلُهُ فِي الظُّلُمَاتِ لَيْسَ بِخَارِجٍ مِنْهَا كَذَلِكَ زُيِّنَ لِلْكَافِرِينَ مَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. And this is in Surah Al-An'am, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, giving us this beautiful example for us to reflect upon. أَوَمَنْ كَانَ مَيْتًا. Think of this. Someone dead is dead. Imagine someone is dead, and we know what dead is. Someone to be dead, that means there's no life whatsoever. And when you see someone dead, it's just flesh. فَأَحْيَيْنَاهُ. We gave him life. We see how the difference between life and death, completely different. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, if someone is dead, and we give him life, and then وَجَعَلْنَا لَهُ نُورًا يَمْشِي بِهِ فِي النَّاسِ, and we give him light, that he would walk with this light among the people. Is he the same as someone, the like of him, فِي الظُّلُمَاتِ لَيْسَ بِخَارِجٍ مِنْهَا, in darknesses, that he's never going to be out of it? Before we end the verse, think of these two examples. Someone that was dead, and Allah gave him life and gave him light, that he walks among people with this light. Is he the same as someone that is in total darknesses, not just one, but many darknesses, and he won't leave it whatsoever? Anybody, when that example is explained and expressed to them, they would say definitely major differences. But this is how, and this is the real deception of this life, and this is what we need to pay attention to. Most of the human beings are deceived because of not knowing these types of parables and examples. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كَذَلِكَ زُيِّنَ الْكَافِرِينَ مَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. This is exactly how the disbelievers, it's been adorned for them what they're doing. Their evil actions is adorned, beautified to them exactly in the same manner. That means they are in total darknesses. They would never go out of it unless they receive the light of revelation from Allah by following the Quran and the way the Prophet ﷺ. They are dead. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called them dead. أَمْوَاتٌ غَيْرُ أَحْيَاء. They are dead, they're not alive. They are physically alive, yes, but as long as they are disbelievers, they are dead. They're not having the life of al-Iman, the life of faith, the life of knowing the purpose of our life. And this is how this is related to the light, and how the importance of the light. Who's the owner of all of this? As we said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the same surah, Surah Al-An'am, in the beginning of it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Alhamdulillahi alladhi khalaqa as-samawati wal-ard wa ja'ala al-dhulumati wal-nur thumma alladhina kafaru bi rabbihim ya'dilun. That praise be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one that created the heavens and the earth, and He made the darknesses and the light. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that made both. The physical darknesses and the physical light, and also the darknesses of disbelief, the darknesses of associating partners with Allah, the darknesses of innovation in the deen, the darknesses of sins. And He's the one that made the light of al-Iman and the obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا بِرَبِّهِمْ يَعْدِلُونَ. Then the disbelievers, they they choose other than Allah. They believe in other than Allah. They associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is all for the believers. When they read this, they know how to acquire the light, which is the book of Allah. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called the Quran. Called it Noor. The Quran is light. We brought down to you a clear light. Clear light from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that supports the believers. Allahu waliyyu alladhina amanu yukhrijuhum min al-dhulumati ila al-nur. وَالَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا أَوْلِيَاؤُهُمُ الطَّاغُوتُ يُخْرِجُونَهُم مِّنَ النُّورِ إِلَى الظُّلُمَاتِ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the wali, the supporter, the helper of the believers. He takes them out from the darknesses to the light. And the disbelievers, their supporters and helpers are the taghut. Anything that is being worshipped besides Allah, followed other than Allah, obeyed other than Allah, would take them from the light to the darknesses. أُولَٰئِكَ أَصْحَابُ النَّارِ هُمْ فِيهَا خَالِدُونَ. They are the people of the hellfire. They will be in it forever. And it shows how the contrast between the darknesses and the light, and how a person should only receive this from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the only way for a person to receive the light, when it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is by following the revelation from Allah. See how the verse even started like Allah nuru samawati wal ard. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the supporter and the helper of the believers. He's the one that takes them from the darknesses to the light. You see how much actions that we need to do? It's an everyday job. We need to see our life as this is the life that we live in. We're taking ourselves away from darknesses, and we are subjecting ourselves to the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by constantly following the way of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And this is basically the life of the deen of Islam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called the book of Allah and the previous books as lights from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it very clear that this is the light that we need to seek. And as the beginning of Surah Ibrahim, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كِتَابٌ أَنزَلْنَاهُ إِلَيْكَ مُبَارَكٌ أو كِتَابٌ أَنزَلْنَاهُ إِلَيْكَ لِتُخْرِجَ النَّاسِ مِنَ الظُّلُمَاتِ إِلَى النُّورِ بِإِذْنِ رَبِّهِمْ. That means this is a book that we brought down to you, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, for you to take the people out from the darknesses to the light. And this is the Salat al-Mustaqim. This is the straight path that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered the believers to be upon, ordered humanity to be upon. بِإِذْنِ رَبِّهِمْ إِلَى صَلَاةِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَمِيدِ. And the Salat, as we know that there is the Salat al-Mustaqim, the straight path. But here it's mentioned إِلَى صَلَاةِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَمِيدِ. To the Salat, to the path of Al-Aziz, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Almighty, Al-Hamid, the one that is praiseworthy. And we talked about these two names of Allah before, and the attributes that are with it. And this is the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the owner of this Sirat. So nobody have the power whatsoever other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's the Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one that is full of praise. So whoever wants to be upon the light, seek that from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is Al-Aziz. He's the one that is the Almighty, the most strong subhanahu wa ta'ala, for people to be upon the light. When we talk about the way of the Prophet ﷺ, you know that we talked about a person being a disbeliever, he needs the light from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be a believer. And within the fold of Islam, we are in constant need for the light and the guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be upon the way of the Prophet ﷺ. So it's not either or, either some light or either perfect light or perfect darknesses. No, there is something in between. And that is deviations, sins. It takes away, from the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is upon the person. Sins, disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes the person into that darkness. And according to how much a person is disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and following other than the way the Prophet ﷺ, the person will be in darknesses, and therefore people would not get things straight. They won't understand things in the proper way. Sins does this. And that's something that many people, they might not relate to because they have no knowledge of it. The only knowledge that we get is from the Quran and the Sunnah about this matter, about this subject. Again, sins has a direct relationship to your intellect and your ability to see things in the proper way. Sins has a direct relationship to how a person to be deceived or not. When a person commits a sin, does not repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then he is taken the path of being deceived. even if he's very smart, even if he's the smartest person on the face of earth, very good and excellent when it comes to materialistic, physical type of sciences, chemistry, physics, medicine, whatever there is. But because of the sins, and the worst of all sins, of course, is disbelief, that person is not able to see things in the right way. His opinions, his intellect, his means of knowing what is right and what is wrong is totally disturbed. He's not able to see the right from what is wrong because of this fact. Because of the light has been taken away. And when there's no light, there's darknesses. And as we heard how the disbelievers, they are deceived in this life. Why? Because they are in total darkness. And the real darkness is when a person does not understand, does not know the purpose of their life, and therefore their criteria of things, their values, their principles in life, everything becomes disturbed. And that's one of the sins that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that causes this to the person, is eating or consuming usury, riba. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that in the Quran. الَّذِينَ يَأْكُلُونَ الرِّبَا لَا يَقُومُونَ إِلَّا كَمَا يَقُومُ الَّذِي يَتَخَبَّطُهُ الشَّيْطَانُ مِنَ الْمَسِّ. That those who eats the riba, that means those who consume it, those who have it, those who deal with it, they don't get up, whether it's in the hereafter or in this life, except like the person that has been beaten up by shaitan, being affected by the shaitan, being touched by the shaitan, someone that is being possessed by the shaitan, by the devil. When someone is possessed by the shaitan, he doesn't look like he's acting in the proper way. So this is how the affairs of those who would deal with usury, something that many people are afflicted with in the days that we live in. That's why a person, if he wants to purify his heart, to be away from sins, to acquire the light from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to stay away from these sins. And don't find excuse for your own self, because of my business, because of my house that I want to purchase, or because of my car that I want to purchase. All of these things, whoever fears Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make it easy for him. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ لَهُ نُورًا فَمَا لَهُ مِن نُور. If a person, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, does not have light for him, there's no light for him. And he will keep on being followed in these darknesses, وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ, unless a person repents to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one of the beautiful things also mentioned is that the dua to be upon the light, and to be upon the light of Allah. And the dua that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praising the believers, and mentioning the believers, and taking the believers out of darknesses to the light, as we heard in some verses before. But also the angels, they make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala save the believers from darknesses. هو الذي يصلي عليكم وملائكته ليخرجكم من الظلمات إلى النور وكان بالمؤمنين رحيما. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He praise the believers, and the angels, they make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the believers, for them to go out of darknesses and to be upon the light. And we're weak as human beings, and sometimes we slip away. And therefore, when a person is sincere to acquire the light and to be truthful with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can save them from falling into the darknesses. وَكَانَ بِالْمُؤْمِنِينَ رَحِيمًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most merciful to the believers. And when they meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would give the salam. تَحِيَّتُهُمْ يَوْمَ يَلْقَوْنَهُ salam. وَأَعَدَّ لَهُمْ أَجْرًا كَرِيمًا. They would receive a very honored reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then, if you look to the next verses, there's still light is mentioned there. يَا أَيُّهَا النَّبِيُّ إِنَّا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ شَاهِدًا وَمُبَشِّرًا وَنَذِيرًا وَدَاعِيًا إِلَى اللَّهِ بِإِذْنِهِ وَسِرَاجًا مُنِيرًا. Which means, O Prophet of Allah, we have sent you shahidan, as a witness, and mubashiran, and someone that gives the good news and the glad tidings, وَنَذِيرًا, and a warner, وَدَاعِيًا إِلَى اللَّهِ, number 4, and to call to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala بِإِذْنِهِ, by the permission of Allah, وَسِرَاجًا مُنِيرًا, and a light bulb, or a light source of light. Siraj is a source of light. The Prophet ﷺ is a source of light to humanity. And he is the mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to humanity. He gave this light, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is this light? Is the way of the Prophet ﷺ. The revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the Prophet ﷺ. And therefore those who turn away from the way of the Prophet ﷺ, they are in darknesses. They cannot able to see what is right and what is wrong. And those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make them embrace the religion of Islam, They have this light from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran, فَمَنْ شَرَحَ اللَّهُ صَدْرَهُ لِلْإِسْلَامِ فَهُوَ عَلَى نُورٍ مِّن رَبِّهِ. Those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expand their breast with al-Islam, they are upon light from the Lord. And therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warned against those who their hearts are hard. فَوَيْلُ لِلْقَاسِيَةِ قُلُوبُهُم مِّن ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. Woe to those who their hearts are hard, and that's what we're talking about, purification of our hearts from the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أَفَمَنْ شَرَحَ اللَّهُ صَدْرَهُ لِلْإِسْلَامِ فَهُوَ عَلَى نُورٍ مِّن رَبِّهِ. The one that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala شرح الله صدره, and we know that Surah Alam Nashrah Laka Sadrak. As-Sadr is the breast, and that's the place where the heart is. And in Shirah al-Sadr is when it's spacious. You know, when a person feels tightness in his heart, you know, it doesn't have to be a physical one, but this is the sign of disbelief. A person is not comfortable. So a person to be a Muslim, to be pleased with the deen of Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would make his chest comfortable, that he have this iman, this faith in. He has a light from his Lord. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warned those who have hardness in their hearts when it comes to the dhikr, remembrance of Allah, أُولَٰئِكَ فِي ضَلَالٍ مُبِينٍ. They are the ones in clear astray, as because of their forgetfulness and away from the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are many verses in the Quran that talks about this, the light of Allah. Whether it's that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give light, or whether Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the light of the heavens and the earth. And it's our chance in this short period of time that we live on the face of earth to acquire this life, this light, and to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the light of the heavens and the earth, by following the Quran and the way the Prophet ﷺ, by making sure that we establish the salah, that we make the dhikr of Allah, that we stay away from sins. Sins are wicked and evil and impure and darknesses. Why would a person incur this upon himself for some moments of desire that becomes the outcome of it? Darknesses and filth in the hearts and tightness in the chest and so on and so forth. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us among those who receive the light from Allah, from among those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide them and bestow His light upon them. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us steadfastness upon the deen of Allah and the way of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Wa sallallahu sallam wa baraka ala Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.